Introduction of the couple. Emma had always believed she had the kind of marriage others envied. Her husband, Daniel, was everything she thought she needed in a partner: charming, attentive, and dependable. They had been married for 6 years, and in that time, Daniel had rarely given her any reason to doubt him. He brought her coffee every morning before she got out of bed, left little notes in her purse before she left for work, and made sure they had date night every Friday without fail. To everyone around them, they were the picture of a perfect couple. Their home, a modest but cozy house tucked in a quiet suburban neighborhood, reflected their shared life. Family photos lined the mantel: vacations in Paris, a snowy Christmas in Vermont, their wedding day framed in delicate gold. Emma worked as a freelance graphic designer, which gave her the flexibility to manage the household, while Daniel, a regional sales manager for a pharmaceutical company, spent his weekdays on the road or in client meetings. Mornings were always the same. Emma would wake up to the soft aroma of coffee, stretch beneath the warm sheets, and hear the gentle hum of Daniel humming a tune in the kitchen. He'd appear moments later with her favorite mug and a kiss on the forehead. "Black, 2 sugars, just how you like it," he'd say, smiling in that familiar way that always made her feel safe. They would sit across from each other during breakfast, discussing the day's plans, his meetings, her deadlines, weekend errands. It wasn't glamorous, but it was comforting, predictable, loving. Every Friday evening, no matter how hectic the week had been, Daniel insisted on taking her out. Whether it was a candle-lit dinner at their favorite Italian restaurant or a simple walk through the park, he made time. Emma often felt lucky to have a husband who still seemed invested after so many years. Their friends admired their bond. Her sister once said, "You hit the jackpot with Daniel," and Emma couldn't help but agree. But slowly, very slowly, little things began to change. A missed Friday night here, a vague excuse about work running late there. The coffee started arriving later in the mornings, or sometimes not at all. Emma tried to dismiss it as work stress. After all, Daniel had always been reliable. If something was wrong, he would tell her, wouldn't he? Still, a strange unease settled in the back of her mind. Nothing obvious, just a faint whisper of doubt. But at this point, she still trusted him. Completely. She had no idea that everything she thought she knew about her marriage was about to be tested. One quiet evening, when Daniel left for what he claimed was a late-night client meeting, Emma made a choice. A simple, irreversible choice. She decided to follow him. Suspicion arises. At first, it was small things, barely noticeable and easy to brush off. Daniel started coming home later than usual, often citing last-minute meetings or extended travel routes due to traffic. Emma didn't think much of it. After all, his job had always been demanding, and he'd never given her a real reason to doubt him. But then came the phone calls. They'd start just as they were sitting down for dinner or settling in to watch a show. Daniel would glance at his phone, mutter something about a work emergency, and step outside to take the call. The first few times, Emma continued eating, trusting his explanation. But the more it happened, the more her mind began to wander. He never talked for long, and when he returned, he always seemed distracted, lost in thought, his fork pushing food around the plate rather than eating. Once, she caught him ending a call with a soft laugh and the words, "Talk soon." It didn't sound like a client call. He had also started guarding his phone more closely. Where once it had been left on the kitchen counter or nightstand without a second thought, now it was always in his pocket or face down on the table. Emma noticed him typing messages in the bathroom, in the garage, even during their movie nights. Whenever she glanced over, he'd lock the screen immediately. Still, she tried not to jump to conclusions. She reminded herself that marriages go through phases, and maybe he was just stressed. Maybe he was planning a surprise. Maybe she was overthinking. But one day, she noticed something that she couldn't ignore. While doing laundry, Emma emptied Daniel's jacket pockets and found a crumpled receipt from a restaurant they'd never been to together. An expensive place on the other side of town. The date and time stamped on it matched a night he had told her he was stuck in traffic on the highway. Her stomach sank. She tried to dismiss it. Maybe it was a business lunch or a client dinner he forgot to mention. But when she casually brought up the restaurant in conversation, asking if he'd ever been, Daniel hesitated. "No," he said, a beat too late, eyes flickering away. "Never heard of it." That was the moment something inside her shifted. The next few days passed in a fog. She watched him closely, his gestures, his words, the way he kissed her goodnight. He still smiled, still brought her coffee some mornings, but there was something missing. A warmth that used to be there now felt forced, mechanical. Her heart ached with confusion. She didn't want to believe it, but the signs were becoming too hard to ignore. Whatever was happening, Daniel wasn't the same man she had married. Not anymore. Emma didn't want to accuse without proof, but she knew one thing for sure. If there was something he was hiding, she was going to find out. She just had to be brave enough to look. Decision to follow him. It was a Thursday evening when Emma finally made up her mind. The unease had been building for weeks, curling around her chest like a tightening rope. She could no longer sleep soundly or focus on her work. Her thoughts were consumed with what-ifs and shadowy doubts. She needed answers, not assumptions, not guesses, but the truth. And if Daniel wouldn't give it to her, she would find it herself. That night, he came home a little too late, smelling faintly of cologne that wasn't his usual scent. He smiled, kissed her cheek, and apologized for the delay. "Long meeting," he said, tossing his keys in the bowl by the door. "I'll need to head out again after dinner. There's a client emergency at the office." Emma forced a nod and a smile. "Of course. I hope everything's okay." He ate quickly, barely engaging in conversation, then slipped upstairs to change. Emma sat at the table, fingers clenched tightly around her glass of water. Her heart was racing, but her mind was sharp. If she hesitated, she'd regret it forever. 15 minutes later, Daniel came down in a fresh shirt, phone in hand, car keys jingling. "I won't be long," he said casually, planting a quick kiss on her forehead. Emma watched the door close behind him, then stood. Her breath came in shallow bursts as she quickly grabbed her jacket and slipped on a pair of sneakers. She waited 30 seconds, then stepped outside, locking the door quietly behind her. Her car was parked across the street, hidden by the neighbor's hedges. She slid into the driver's seat, turned off the lights, and waited just long enough for Daniel's tail lights to disappear around the corner before pulling out to follow. She kept a safe distance, relying on the faint glow of his car rather than headlights. The streets were mostly quiet, the occasional street lamp casting eerie shadows across the road. Her fingers gripped the steering wheel tightly as the minutes passed. The silence in her car was deafening, just the soft hum of the engine and her own racing thoughts. He didn't take the usual route to the office. In fact, he didn't head downtown at all. Instead, he turned onto a narrow side street Emma didn't recognize. The area was unfamiliar, darker, more secluded. She slowed down as he pulled into a parking lot beside an old brick building with no obvious signage. He stepped out of the car and looked around, then entered through a side door. Emma parked a block away, her hands trembling. Every instinct screamed at her to turn around and go home, to preserve whatever illusion still remained. But she'd already come this far. She stepped out of the car, pulling her hood up and wrapping her coat tightly around herself. With every step toward that building, her heart pounded louder in her ears. She had no idea what she was about to uncover. But she knew one thing for certain. After tonight, there would be no going back. The journey begins. Emma stood in the shadows, barely breathing, her eyes fixed on the side door Daniel had disappeared through. Her mind raced, desperately trying to make sense of what this place could be. The building looked abandoned from the outside. No windows, no signs, just bricks aged by time and weather. Nothing about it resembled an office. She waited for a few minutes, steadying her nerves. Then she crept closer, her steps slow and deliberate, keeping to the edge of the streetlight's reach. A rusted metal staircase wrapped around the side of the building, leading up to a second-floor door, slightly ajar. The faintest glow spilled from it, flickering like candlelight. Emma's heart thudded like a drumbeat in her chest. "What am I doing?" she thought. But her feet didn't stop moving. She had to know. She had to see. She tiptoed up the stairs, wincing at the occasional creak beneath her weight. At the top, she crouched beside the door, careful not to be seen. Voices floated out, low, indistinct, muffled by the walls. One of them was definitely Daniel's. Peeking through the crack, she glimpsed a small room with old wooden floors and dim yellow light. There were a few chairs, a table, and several people standing in a semicircle, all facing something or someone at the center. Daniel stood among them, his back to her. Emma strained to hear. They weren't arguing. The tone was calm, focused, serious, almost reverent. She ducked back quickly when someone shifted and glanced toward the door. Her pulse roared in her ears. What was this place? Some kind of secret meeting? A support group? A cult? She didn't know what terrified her more, the idea that he might be doing something illegal, or the possibility that he was simply living a life she'd never known about, hidden in plain sight. After a few minutes, the door creaked louder, and the group began to disperse. Emma slipped down the staircase, heart pounding, and ducked behind a dumpster in the alley. She crouched low as the door opened above, and Daniel descended. He looked different. Not frantic or secretive, serene, focused. He didn't look like someone hiding a betrayal. He looked like someone who had made peace with something. That only deepened the confusion in Emma's heart. She followed again, this time on foot, keeping her distance as he walked to his car. He didn't drive home. Instead, he turned onto another dark street and started walking, purposefully, like he knew exactly where he was going. Emma kept pace a block behind, the chill of the night sharp against her skin, but she barely noticed. Her anxiety had transformed into something else now, a relentless determination to uncover the truth. She had stepped out of the safety of her familiar world and into a maze of questions, shadows, and secrets. And though fear pulsed with every heartbeat, one thing had become clear. Whatever Daniel was involved in, it was much bigger than she had imagined. Unexpected stop. Emma stayed several paces behind, careful not to let her footsteps echo in the silence of the night. Daniel walked with a strange calmness, no signs of nervousness or guilt. If anything, he looked comfortable, like a man returning to something familiar. That unsettled her more than if he'd been acting suspicious. After nearly 15 minutes of walking through narrow, poorly lit streets, Daniel finally stopped. Emma ducked behind a tall fence, peering through a gap in the boards. They were in a part of town she didn't recognize. Quiet, almost deserted. Most of the buildings here looked old and worn, with ivy creeping up the walls and broken streetlights flickering weakly. Ahead of him stood a house, if it could still be called that. It looked more like an old Victorian relic, tucked behind overgrown hedges and hidden from plain sight. The windows were tall but dark, and the paint on the door was chipped and fading, no sign, no lights from inside, just a dim porch light casting long shadows across the yard. Emma watched as Daniel walked up the steps without hesitation and knocked 3 times, slow, rhythmic, deliberate. A few seconds later, the door opened just enough for him to slip inside. Then it shut. She stayed frozen in place, heart pounding like thunder in her ears. The whole setting felt surreal, like something out of a movie. A part of her wanted to run, to escape back into the safety of ignorance. But the stronger part, the one that had followed him this far, refused to turn away. She waited, her breath fogging in the cold night air, trying to make sense of it all. What kind of place is this? It wasn't a business, and it certainly didn't look like someone's home, at least not anymore. It had the eerie stillness of a place with secrets. After a few minutes of nothing, no movement, no sounds, Emma crept closer. She moved through the side yard, crouching low behind thick bushes until she reached a window partially cracked open. She hesitated, then slowly rose to peer inside. What she saw stopped her cold. The room was dim, lit only by a few tall candles. Daniel stood in the center with several others, some seated, some standing, all dressed in dark clothing. There was something ceremonial about the arrangement. No one spoke. They just listened as a woman, older, with a commanding presence, read from a small leather-bound book in a language Emma didn't recognize. A chill ran down her spine. What is this? Daniel didn't look uncomfortable. He looked devoted, present, as if this strange, hidden ritual was part of his life, part of who he was. Emma stepped back from the window, heart racing, hands shaking. Everything she thought she knew was unraveling in front of her, and somehow she knew this was only the beginning. Shocking discovery. Emma crouched beneath the window, the cold seeping through her coat, but she hardly noticed. Her eyes remained fixed on the surreal scene inside. The candle-lit room glowed with a quiet intensity, casting long, flickering shadows along the walls. The people inside were eerily silent, all turned toward the woman who continued to read in that strange, unrecognizable language. And Daniel. He stood still, eyes closed, lips slightly parted as though in silent prayer or meditation. His face, so familiar to her, looked different here. Serene, focused, transformed. Then the woman stopped reading. She closed the book slowly, cradling it in her hands like it was something sacred. A moment of stillness followed. Then she gestured toward Daniel. Emma's heart skipped a beat. Daniel stepped forward. The others parted to make space for him. From behind a thick curtain at the back of the room, someone emerged. A young girl, maybe 12 or 13, her face pale, her eyes wide with nervousness. Emma leaned in instinctively, eyes narrowing. The girl didn't look afraid, but she definitely looked uncertain. Daniel knelt in front of her, reaching gently for her hand. He spoke to her softly. Emma couldn't hear the words, but his voice was low, careful, comforting. The girl nodded once, hesitantly. Then something astonishing happened. The woman handed Daniel a small object, round, metallic, glinting in the candlelight. A medallion? A token? He pressed it into the girl's palm, then pulled her into a gentle embrace. The people surrounding them began to hum, a deep, resonant sound that filled the room with an odd sense of warmth. It wasn't threatening. It was almost healing. Emma's breath caught in her throat. This wasn't a cult. Not in the dangerous, manipulative way she feared. It was something else. A gathering, a ritual, a quiet sanctuary, perhaps, for people in need. Her husband, her Daniel, wasn't sneaking off to have an affair. He was helping someone. He was part of something he had never spoken about, something deeply personal. She watched as the young girl was led to a chair, where another woman wrapped a shawl around her shoulders. The girl looked calmer now. Safe. Emma stared in disbelief. This wasn't what she'd expected. Not even close. She leaned back from the window, blinking away tears she hadn't realized were forming. Her confusion had shifted, no longer rooted in betrayal, but in the shock of discovering a side of Daniel she had never known. A secret not born of deception, but of quiet purpose. Still, questions swirled in her mind. Why hadn't he told her? Why did he feel the need to keep this hidden? And what exactly was this place? She didn't have the answers, not yet. But what she had seen was undeniable. Her husband was living a second life, not one of infidelity or lies, but one wrapped in silence, mystery, and something far deeper than she could have imagined. Confrontation or withdrawal. Emma stepped away from the window, her mind spinning with questions. The image of Daniel kneeling before the frightened girl lingered in her thoughts, stirring something she couldn't quite name. Relief? Confusion? Betrayal? It was all tangled together in a tight knot inside her chest. She had followed him expecting a secret affair, maybe even something criminal. But what she found was far more complex, and in some ways, more unsettling. It wasn't the secrecy that hurt the most, it was the intimacy of it. The tenderness he had shown that young girl, the quiet reverence he had shared with the others in that room. And yet, he had never told her. Not in 6 years of marriage had he ever mentioned this place, these people, or what he did here. What else had he hidden? Emma stood in the dark, one hand gripping the side of the building for balance. Her other clenched tightly around her phone. Her instinct was to burst through that door, confront him, demand answers. Why didn't you tell me? Who are these people? What are you doing here? The questions formed like fire on her tongue, burning to be released. But she didn't move, because beneath her rising anger was a deeper, quieter fear. What if I don't like the answers? What if I never really knew him at all? She slid down the wall and sat on the cold ground, just out of view. Her breath formed little clouds in the air as she tried to calm herself. The candlelit room continued to flicker gently through the window, casting long shadows on the curtains. He's helping someone, she reminded herself. That's not a betrayal. That's not a crime. But still, the secrecy gnawed at her. She tried to think back. Had there been signs? Times he'd withdrawn, seemed emotionally distant? Maybe all those late-night work calls were really this group, this mission, or whatever it was. And yet, he had never offered even a hint. Emma stared at the ground. Confronting him now, in front of those people, would only expose that she had followed him, that she didn't trust him. She would lose the chance to understand the why behind the silence. And maybe, just maybe, there was more to see, more to learn. Her anger slowly gave way to something else. Curiosity. She didn't want to fight. Not yet. Not without the whole truth. So she stood, brushed herself off, and quietly backed away from the window. She'd seen enough for one night. As she walked toward her car, the sharp wind nipped at her face, but she barely felt it. Her mind was miles away, already playing back every second of what she had witnessed, every wordless exchange, every clue. Tonight, she would stay silent. But soon, very soon, she would ask him everything, and he would have to choose. Tell the truth, or lose her forever. Emotional conflict. The drive home was a blur. Emma's hands gripped the steering wheel, knuckles white, eyes fixed on the road, but her thoughts weren't with her. They swirled violently, replaying every moment of what she had seen. The candlelit room, the people gathered in silent reverence, the young girl, and Daniel, her husband, standing in the center of it all, like he belonged to another world. She parked in their driveway and just sat there, staring at the porch light he'd left on for her, like always. That small gesture twisted the knife deeper. He still acted like nothing had changed, like he had nothing to hide. But he did. Something big. Emma let her head fall back against the headrest. Her stomach churned with a cocktail of emotions that refused to settle. Part of her still felt the sting of betrayal. Not the kind tied to infidelity. At least, she no longer thought that was the case, but the betrayal of secrecy. The man she loved had an entire second life, a hidden purpose, a side of himself she had never seen, never been invited into. That wounded her more than she expected. What did it mean that he hadn't trusted her with this? Was she not strong enough to understand it? Not worthy of knowing? But alongside the hurt was something more complicated, sympathy. She couldn't forget the way Daniel had held that girl's hand, how gently he had spoken to her, how committed he looked inside that circle. It hadn't been selfish. It hadn't been cruel. Whatever this was, it had depth, compassion, even purpose. It wasn't the secret of a man cheating on his wife. It was the secret of a man carrying a quiet burden. That realization made the pain sharper. She wanted to admire him for it, but how could she when he had chosen to keep her in the dark? Emma pressed her fingers to her temples, trying to block the swirl of conflicting thoughts. Maybe he thought he was protecting her. Maybe he believed it was easier to shield her from whatever this group did or stood for. Or maybe he was protecting himself from her judgment, from questions he didn't want to answer. That thought hurt most of all. She had always believed they shared everything, the good, the bad, the vulnerable. That had been the foundation of their marriage. And now she wasn't sure if it had ever been true. Tears slipped silently down her cheeks. Not from anger, but from confusion. How do you reconcile the man who brings you flowers and kisses your forehead in the morning with the man who disappears into secret rooms and speaks languages you don't recognize? She didn't know whether to confront him or continue watching. She didn't know if she should be proud of him or terrified of what else he might be hiding. All she knew was this: her heart was torn in two, and the only person who could mend it was the one who had broken it. Daniel reached out, taking her hand in his. "I never wanted to lie to you. I just didn't want you to think that I was doing this for the wrong reasons." For a moment they stood there, the weight of the silence between them heavy with unsaid words. But in that silence, Emma understood. He hadn't lied about his heart. He hadn't lied about his mission. He had simply kept a part of his life hidden, not out of malice, but out of a desire to protect her from the darkness he had witnessed. The truth was painful, but it wasn't the kind of betrayal she had feared. It was a truth she could learn to live with. "I'm not angry," she whispered, looking up at him. I'm just hurt you didn't trust me with this." Daniel nodded, his face full of remorse. "I'll do whatever it takes to earn that trust back." Emma squeezed his hand, the sting of betrayal still fresh, but softened by the clarity of the truth. There was a long road ahead of them, a road of healing, understanding, and reconnection. But for the first time in days, Emma felt like she wasn't just guessing at the truth anymore. She was standing in it. Conclusion and resolution. The days following their conversation were not easy. The air between Emma and Daniel had shifted, and though they both tried to carry on with their lives, there was an undeniable distance between them now. Emma had learned the truth, and Daniel's confession had lifted the weight of her suspicions, but the deeper pain, the hurt of feeling kept in the dark, of not being trusted with something so important, still lingered in her heart. They spent quiet evenings together, sharing small conversations, avoiding the bigger ones. It was clear that Daniel wanted to make amends. He spent more time talking to her about the work he was doing, explaining the organization and the people involved. He showed her photos of the children they helped, the families they had supported. He tried to make her understand that this wasn't just some secret hobby or a passion project. It was a calling. And yet, despite his earnestness, Emma couldn't help but feel like an outsider in this part of his life, a part that had existed long before she'd come into the picture. For the first time in their marriage, she felt like there was a world in which she didn't belong, a world that Daniel had built without her, and that hurt more than she cared to admit. One night, after a particularly long silence between them, Emma found herself sitting in the living room, staring at the half-empty wine glass on the coffee table. Daniel came in, his expression tired, yet still carrying the quiet remorse of someone who knew he had made a mistake. He sat beside her. "I understand why you're angry," he said softly, his voice thick with regret. "And I understand if you don't want to be with me anymore. I don't want to be the person who hurt you." Emma shook her head, wiping a tear away. "I'm not angry anymore, Daniel. I don't know where we go from here. I can't pretend that everything's fine. I can't act like I'm not still trying to process everything." He reached out, gently taking her hand in his. "I'll give you as much time as you need, but I need you to know, this work, it's everything to me. But you're everything to me too. If you can't accept this part of my life, if it's too much for you, I'll find a way to make it right. I'll give it up. You're my priority." Emma felt a wave of emotion rise up in her chest. She had always believed that love could conquer anything, that the truth would always lead them back to each other. But what if love wasn't enough? What if this was something too big for just the two of them to fix? She thought about the children Daniel helped, the countless lives he had touched. She thought about how much he cared, how deeply invested he was in making a difference. She had seen his passion, his kindness, and the selflessness in his heart. It wasn't something she could easily walk away from, but at the same time, she had to acknowledge her own pain. The isolation she felt in the midst of this secret world, the betrayal of not being included. "I don't want you to give it up," Emma said quietly, her voice wavering. "I don't want to be the one who holds you back. I know how much it means to you, but I need to figure out how we fit into this. Daniel nodded, squeezing her hand. "I'll help you, every step of the way. I want to show you what this means. I want you to be part of it, Emma. not just as my wife, but as someone who understands why it's so important to me. It wasn't the fairy tale resolution Emma had hoped for, nor was it an instant fix, but it was a beginning, a new chapter for their relationship, one that would require patience, understanding, and time. They would have to rebuild the trust that had been broken, not just between them, but with herself. She would have to learn to accept that Daniel's world wasn't a world of secrets or betrayal, but of deep compassion and quiet service. As the days turned into weeks, Emma visited the organization, meeting the children Daniel had spoken so often about. She saw the faces he had shared with her, heard the stories of the families they had helped. Slowly she began to understand, not just the importance of Daniel's work, but why he had kept it so guarded. And with that understanding, Emma started to heal. The wedge between them began to close, not because everything was perfect, but because they were working together, honestly, openly. The foundation of their love was tested, but it was still strong. In the end, they didn't just survive the discovery, they grew from it. They learned that love, in its purest form, wasn't about possession or secrecy. It was about trust, understanding, and the willingness to walk through the darkest moments together, hand in hand.